Two and a Half Admins, episode 203. I'm Joe.
I'm Jim.
And I'm Alan.
And here we are again. A couple of episodes ago for our 200th episode spectacular, we did a free consulting special. And we didn't get to answer anywhere near all of the questions, so we thought, let's do another episode where we answer your questions. A reminder that you can send in your questions for future episodes to show@2.5admins.com. And also a thank you to everyone who supports us with PayPal and Patreon. We really do appreciate that. You can learn more at 2.5admins.com/support. Boston writes, I would really like to hear your opinion about this UK law that came into effect recently. And this is the Product Security and Telecommunications Infrastructure Act, or PSTI Act. Even though this is only for the UK, which is not even part of the EU anymore, yeah, rub it in, man, thanks. This law will have global impact. Global companies will not make two software stacks, one secure and one not, will they? Is this really a good law? Not only the content, but the depth and quality of the baseline requirements that this proposes. Even the words used are correct. Am I missing something?
So first up, let's talk about what the law actually is. Basically, there are three provisions here. The manufacturer must not supply devices that use default passwords. Now, the reason for this is if you use a default password for an entire class of device, it is going to get leaked online and be real easy for anybody to find and use. And the majority of people just aren't going to change whatever password their device shipped with.
Like to the point where there was a website for tens of years where you would go and put in the model of your router and it would tell you what the default password was. And it had the default password for like 10,000 models of router, because that's the thing you needed to log in to set up port forwarding to play a video game.
Oh, those sites are still out there and still cover an awful lot of that stuff, as well as, an incredible number of photocopiers and, you name it. So if the security actually matters, and arguably, maybe it doesn't matter that much in a photocopier, but it certainly does on your router. So this is definitely a great provision. Provision number 2, manufacturer must provide a point of contact for the reporting of security issues. This is important because if the manufacturer is just ignoring security issues, well, then devices can be exploitable, obviously. Now, this is also a good provision to have, but it kind of falls under the yeah, duh, and I don't know how much teeth this is really going to have. It's easy to force a manufacturer to have an abuse-at email address. I don't know that this act is really going to give a whole lot of teeth for like auditing how they're responding to reports that are sent into that address. So this is a great idea. It doesn't necessarily go very far. Our third point and final point is and this is the one I really like, by the way. The manufacturer must state the minimum length of time for which the device will receive important security updates. Now, this is a huge one because, as we've seen over and over again, people tend to use devices for far longer than manufacturers would prefer to continue supporting them. So if you've got a, supported through 2030, sticker on your router box when you buy it, then you can actually have an informed decision-making process about, do I want to get this router that's on a great sale right now? How many years of use will I have left before it potentially just becomes a paperweight due to no longer getting any security upgrades? And again, let's be clear, if your router is no longer getting security upgrades, I don't care if you can get to the internet, it's a paperweight. You need to replace it.
Yeah, so there's similar laws coming to the US in the Cyber Trust Act, and I forget the name of the one in the EU. Although they're all taking slightly different approaches, the US one is more optional, and it's like if you meet the criteria, you get a QR code on the box that can be revoked. So it's like the QR code goes to the government's website and says, yes, this device is still getting updates and it's not had any CVEs that haven't been fixed and that kind of thing, which maybe goes further than this, but it doesn't have the teeth that the UK one does. They say here, most smart devices are manufactured outside of the UK, but the Act also applies to all organizations that import or retail products for the UK market. Failure to comply with the Act is a criminal offense with a fine of up to $10 million or 4% of your qualifying worldwide revenue, whichever is higher. So that's some pretty big teeth, although it's not clear where the line's going to be. And it's very interesting to put the onus on the company just importing and selling the product, not necessarily the manufacturer in this case, because they don't have the reach to force a manufacturer in another country to do something. And so it could be interesting what the retailers and importers in the UK have to do to get devices that meet these standards.
I think it's a good approach, though, because like you said, it's a lot easier to lean on the importer that's right there in the country with you. And ultimately, if none of the importers can sell your product in country, they're not going to buy it from you, which means that even though the UK government doesn't have the direct legal standing to, drag an Asus or Netgear or who have you into court necessarily, if they want to sell their products in the UK market, they're still going to need to comply or none of the UK importers are going to buy them. Now, the other thing about this, I think it's interesting that the UK law is simpler and has, I would argue, fewer interesting provisions than the US version, but it has a lot nastier teeth. And the way this tends to work out in practice is the manufacturers, they're not going to want to give up a market as large as the UK, let alone the United States. And Bastian was correct. Typically, they want to try to make a single product line that they can sell in as many markets as possible. So what that means is they're going to wind up complying with the US law, which is more comprehensive, but has fewer teeth, as though it had the teeth of the UK law, because they want to be able to sell in both places. And if they have to meet the UK provisions, they might as well go ahead and go a little bit further and do what they need to do in order to get that QR code to make the US market feel better about their device.
Yeah, especially if their competitors are too. Also, I think the UK law has a different provision about what devices it affects. The US one is kind of targeting specific things and making kind of very concrete benchmarks for those individual things, like the rules for a router are different than the rules for a power converter. Whereas the UK law applies to, quote, any consumer smart device, which connects either to the internet or to a home network, for example, by Wi-Fi. So the UK law applies to smart speakers, smart TVs, streaming devices, smart doorbells, baby monitors, security cameras, fitness trackers, light bulbs, plugs, kettles, thermostats, fridges, cleaners, washing machines, etc. Which is very interesting. It doesn't really apply to cybersecurity, but as a consumer protection thing, they have this clause 3 that says there's a minimum amount of time that the device will get security updates. But if you look at fitness trackers, maybe we want a law that says there's a minimum amount of time where the cloud service for this is guaranteed to keep working.
That is an excellent point.
Because how many people bought a fitness tracker and have found the back end behind it has gone away and it is now a paperweight? And sometimes it's not even a year after you bought it. But that's not cybersecurity, so it doesn't, this law is maybe not the right place to address it. But I think in the future, we could get to the point where labeling also has some guarantee that the cloud service keeps going for this long. Although really, I'd rather have something more, an open standard about this so that I'm not tied to the manufacturer anyway.
Alan, as you're going through that ridiculous laundry list of devices that, could be affected by the UK law, literally including laundry machines, it occurred to me I wouldn't actually be mad about it if laws like this had enough teeth and were difficult enough to comply with, that maybe manufacturers stopped just making literally everything connect to the freaking internet.
Yeah, that's for sure. Although the washing machine is one of the things I wouldn't mind having the ability for it to send a notification to my phone that the laundry's done. But maybe I would not want that to use a cloud service to do it either.
To be fair, even without the cloud service, it would be covered by this law because it would still have to connect at least to your home network. So
yes, but this law would still cover having security and so on. So yeah.
Man, my dishwasher has got a Wi-Fi symbol on it and I am not connecting that to the network. No interest whatsoever, thank you.
Same.
Kevin writes, I've been trying to find a cost-efficient way to back up around 30 terabytes of data off-site. Things like Amazon Glacier are out of the question for me, since it makes backups difficult to routinely verify due to retrieval costs. I've been looking into potentially doing a 1U co-location for a backup server, but I'm not really sure where to start for cost-effective options.
So first of all, I probably wouldn't be looking at co-location for this. I would be looking at renting a bare metal system in a data center. Unfortunately, what I've found is it's usually at least as expensive and frequently more expensive to co-locate your own hardware as it is just to rent a box the data center provides. So if you can rent a box for the same amount of money that they would charge you to put your own box in there, putting your own box in is just kind of leaving money on the table.
The biggest thing is when you rent the box, they have to replace the hard drives when they fail and the power supply and so on for you. When it's your hardware, that's your problem. Yeah, I have a lot of experience with this. The only machines that we co-located were custom-built appliances we had made that could fit 2 video cards in a 1U chassis and so on, and were special enough that the server provider wasn't going to rent us hardware like that. needing over 30 terabytes of data might start to get to the point where the providers charge enough for the extra hard drives that the tipping point for is it cheaper to rent or buy starts to change. But knowing that if a hard drive fails, you're going to have to buy another one and arrange to ship it to the data center. It's going to take a while, and you might have to pay $200 an hour for remote hands to have somebody switch the hard drive for you. Probably does mean that Jim's right, and renting bare metal server with the hard drives in it is still going to be cheaper, and it's going to be a lot less setup cost usually, because paying for it monthly over years will be less than buying all those hard drives up front. And it means as they fail, it's their problem to fix them, not yours.
You could also potentially consider an rsync.net for something like this. The pricing at the 30 terabyte range is going to be 1 penny per gigabyte. You can frequently get a better deal out of them if you actually email them and talk to them and tell them what you're looking for. So that might be worth giving a shot. If having something as simple as just, rsyncing your data off to somebody else's machine is appealing, then that might be a good way to go. rsync.net also offers ZFS-specific options, which obviously Alan and I love. But given that you didn't mention ZFS, I'm guessing ZFS is probably not something you've already got on the front end. And unfortunately, the ZFS-specific option to rsync.net is more expensive per terabyte. So that might not work for you either at your volume. But you didn't tell us what amount you're trying to spend, so it's hard to get real concrete with our advice.
Of course, there's the hobbyist option of just putting a box at one of your friends' houses.
You say hobbyist, but I have lots and lots of very much not hobbyist clients. That's exactly how they manage their backups. They have more than one site available to them, and they use that for their geographic separation. Why wouldn't you?
Yeah, there are other cloud options as well, but I'd say the biggest advantage to the dedicated server is you control the thing on the other side, and so it becomes more of a hot backup. Where, if you do put ZFS on the server, even if it's not on your source and you're rsyncing to ZFS, that means you can run a scrub and do a bunch of stuff with it and have snapshots on that server that you control. And you don't have to try to deal with weird APIs and so on.
A friend of mine managed to get a dirt cheap Hetzner box that was a few generations old, so the performance wasn't great. But this is a backup server. You don't really care about performance, right? And this was a bare metal box. I can't remember how much storage it had, but it was amazingly cheap. And I wonder how they can afford the electricity with the amount of money they're charging him for it. So I would say definitely look out for deals like that on older, outdated hardware, outdated in quotes hardware.
For what he needs, that's probably a tougher option because they don't let you put a bunch of really big hard drives in those. But yeah, I think it's called server bidding, where they have like a reverse auction thing where whoever will pay the most, but the price keeps going down until somebody buys it. For the older hardware, you can get really good deals there.
The issue typically when you're talking about renting a box in a data center is that, yeah, you can get the box dirt cheap because you don't really care that much about the performance if it's just a backup target. But it's not going to have enough storage in it in that dirt cheap configuration to put your 30 terabytes of data on. Now, you can absolutely tell the data center, I would like you to add, say, 3 18 terabyte drives to this box, but they're going to charge the full a la carte rate for those 3 18 terabyte drives, and that may or may not push it up past the price point you're hoping for. But in general, it's not that hard to find the base box that you can then add hard drives to for somewhere between like $70 and $120 a month. Now, if you wanted any real performance, like to run VMs full time, you might start looking at more money. I typically spend anywhere from about $120 to $150 to get a box that's capable of, running 3 or 4 VMs. They're going to see some internet scale traffic on them.
Yeah, although other providers there are places where you can get an E3 V5 for like $50 a month. But yeah, that includes a tiny SSD and that's it. And then if you want hard drives, they get spendy.
I will recommend also, you don't necessarily want to look at just the cheapest provider, which right. the answer to that is usually going to be Hetzner. I don't think I've ever seen anybody beating Hetzner on much of any of its prices. But I can also tell you from personal experience, Hetzner's network configs are quirky and a pain in the ass and kind of difficult to deal with. If you have anything even vaguely complex, like again, especially if you wanted to set up a virtual machine host, you're going to have multiple VMs and you need to run a bridge adapter and route your IP addresses to them. That is a nightmare on Hetzner. Whereas if you go with a slightly more expensive provider, like PhoenixNAP is another one of my favorites, Nothing's weird at PhoenixNAP. They hand you the subnet and everything just works and it's normal. Whereas at Hetzner, they don't actually give you like a subnet. They give you a whole bunch of individual IP addresses and some kind of dodgy instructions on doing some really weird, unusual configs. And it can be pretty difficult to navigate.
Yeah. I also like rootbsd.net and High Velocity as other places where you can rent. And I think that $49 E5 or E3 was from High Velocity. And they have a couple of different locations. And especially if you're in North America, getting a colocation that's in North America can just mean your backup's that much lower latency. One other option is a service called Wasabi. So wasabi.com, they provide S3 compatible API for like 0.7 cents per gigabyte or $7 a terabyte. So that'd be like $209 a month for the 30 terabytes you're talking about. But that's object storage. And so depending how you have to upload the data and how you maintain it, it may or may not be a good fit for what you're doing.
Okay, this episode is sponsored by 1Password. Imagine your company's security like the quad of a college campus. There are nice brick paths between the buildings, those are the company-owned devices, IT-approved apps, and managed employee identities. And then there are the paths people actually use, the shortcuts through the grass. Those are unmanaged devices, shadow IT apps, and non-employee identities like contractors. Most security tools only work on those happy brick paths, but a lot of security problems take place on the shortcuts. 1Password Extended Access Management is the first security solution that brings all these unmanaged devices, apps, and identities under your control. It ensures that every user credential is strong and protected, every device is known and healthy, and every app is visible. 1Password Extended Access Management solves the problems traditional IAM and MDM can't touch. It's security for the way we work today, and it's available now to companies with Okta and coming later this year to Google Workspace and Microsoft Entra. So support the show and check it out at onepassword.com/25A. That's onepassword.com/25A. Brent writes, could you recommend ideally a good book and some lab exercises that would help me understand how to use ZFS and some of its principal features? No good books, I'm afraid, so we better move on. Oh, hang on, didn't you write one, Alan, or co-write one?
2. FreeBSD Mastery ZFS and FreeBSD Mastery Advanced ZFS. As the title suggests, those are specific to FreeBSD, but most of the ZFS stuff is agnostic and, the commands are the same on Linux as on FreeBSD, except for some of the tuning stuff is like instead of a sysctl, it'll be under, sys modules, ZFS parameters or whatever. So if you know a little bit about Linux, you'd be able to apply anything the FreeBSD books tell you to Linux as well.
Honestly, some of the basic stuff I found from Google searches, just the Oracle documentation is actually quite good.
Yes, but you can get led down traps for a couple of features they added that don't exist in open source.
Ah, right.
Some of their stuff also is ways that used to work that way in ZFS, but ZFS has moved on in the last 20 years.
Right, so I should probably not do that anymore then.
The ZFS project needs to do some better SEO so that it gets above Oracle in the search results for that stuff.
Yeah.
I will warn you that Alan's books are good, but they're not primers. The name Mastery in the title is there for a reason. Those books I would consider as more reference material for, getting the difficult to figure out stuff. It's going to be all in one place. If you're starting as a complete newbie, in particular, I don't really know that just reading that book is going to give you the lab exercise-like experience that you're looking for. Unfortunately, I don't have a super easy answer for you for that either, other than just probably your lab exercises boil down to what is it that you want to do? Figure out what that is and do that and learn what you need in order to do that. I mean, that's basically how we learn everything on this show anyway.
So the first book, the Intro to ZFS one, does have some exercises. It's meant for you to be able to follow through and do the commands, that they're not exactly labs. There's a couple in there, but not much for exactly, lab exercises in particular. To Jim's point, yes, they're a reference material and provide a lot of the background of how ZFS works on the inside, not quite so much of a textbook with a bunch of lab exercises. They also assume you have certain other knowledge. It calls it out at the beginning. And there are related books from my co-author on how partitioning works and how specialty file systems like DevFS and NullFS and all that kind of stuff work. So if you are completely new, there's a Storage Essentials book that you probably want to get into before doing the ZFS book, but they should be quite approachable. But as Jim said, they don't actually have a large number of lab exercises. And to Jim's point, in order to get the most out of learning ZFS, you have to kind of have an idea of what you want to do with it and then figure out the bits you need to be able to do that, because that gives you a much better driver to do it than just following a bunch of exercises in a book for the sake of doing the exercises without necessarily connecting it to the thing I actually want to learn to do.
And as I always recommend with tech Bibles, if you just feel like you don't really know enough to know what you want to do with it yet, grab the first of Alan's 2 books and just read it cover to cover over, however many days or weeks that takes you to get through it. You don't have to study. You don't have to take notes. You don't have to try to do exercises right then. Just slog all the way through it. Skim if you gotta. By the time you get to the end, you'll have a much better mental framework that reminds you oh, if I run into this problem, I remember I saw something about that. And you know enough about it to be able to look for it. You know what can be fixed versus what can't be fixed, and you can figure that part out later. For example, if you had read Alan's book or, some of the things I've written or whatever, you might already know ahead of time there is such a thing as record size, and that's frequently something I need to tune if I'm having performance issues with various workloads. And you would get an idea of what that means and how you might tune it. And you don't necessarily remember all of that just from reading the thing. But if a year and a half down the line, you start to have performance problems on one of your systems, you've got that thing in the back of your head going, oh, I remember, what's the thing they're always talking about, the tunable, the first thing to look at? Record size. That's it. That's the kind of thing that you really get from just consuming a tech Bible.
Yeah, or even just, it means when you go and make the second pass, you have all the bits that the instructions are going to connect together. It is interesting with a lot of these things where once you've consumed the whole thing, you can go back, and then when you try to do the exercises, you have all the pieces and it helps put them more into place. And like we've talked about before, when you're trying to learn something, sometimes the way to do it is try to do it, writing down the steps as you do. And when you get to the end, destroy it and do it again following your own instructions. And only that repetition is actually what makes it sink in so that you'll remember how to do it next time.
Corey writes, you recently discussed SMB and how a preferred solution is to virtualize a Windows server to handle this. I don't run Windows clients at home, but NFS only offers per IP restrictions. Kerberos looks unruly and overkill for my home lab. I begrudgingly use SMB on my FreeBSD-based NAS, Sigma NAS, as well as straight-off a Proxmox host. Is there a simple Unix-focused solution to share files with some password protection? Should I just get over the fact that Microsoft made SMB?
My answer to this is SSHFS. That is really the only way you get password protection, access, simple, and Unixy. On Windows, it may be a little bit of a pain in the butt. You said you didn't have Windows clients. A lot of people do. You have to go right now, I believe, to third-party tooling to get an SSHFS kit for Windows. But on Linux, FreeBSD, or Mac, it's built right in. It's easy, and you can divvy things up how you like. Now, that does imply that it will be as though that user has logged into the whole system. Basically, anything that the UID that they're SSHing into that exists on that system, they're going to get access to, which may not be exactly what you want, but there are ways to figure that out. You can carve things up. You can have different shares with different usernames and passwords, even if it's the same actual person connecting in. There's any number of ways to work around that. Basically, if you're super allergic to SMB, but you want password protection, I think that's going to be the way to go.
Yeah, and to Jim's point originally about SMB, it's because he has Windows clients, to make sure they work 100% of the time, he uses the Windows Server for SMB. If you only have open source clients, those are more likely to be tested against Samba for SMB. And so running Samba on your FreeBSD-based NAS and using the SMB clients from BSD and Linux is probably also going to be fine. And if that works for you, then there's no reason to stop doing that way. It depends what requirements you're actually after when you're talking about password-based SMB here. Are you just trying to control who has access to what shares or what? NFS kind of assumes that the user Bob on any system connected over NFS is the right Bob and that your normal file system permissions are going to control who can have access to what. If they're all your machines, that probably is mostly what you want anyway, and maybe you don't need anything more complicated. But if you have the need for something more complicated, then if SMB works, there's not really a reason to not do it that way. Jim's point was mostly about if you're trying to be a Windows file server, being a Windows file server is the best way to do that. But in your case, you're not trying to be a Windows file server, and it's fine to use Samba for the SMB protocol if you're just trying to be a Unix file server.
It absolutely is fine to do that. To be clear, the reason I was recommending SSHFS here is because Corey very specifically said he's only begrudgingly using SMB even as provided by Samba on Zigmanaz and Proxmox.
Right.
So the desire to leave server message block behind is already there. And the way to do that in a simple and Unixy way, again, is going to be SSHFS. Also, I would argue that, he was asking specifically for simplicity. In a lot of ways, SSHFS is a lot simpler than Samba. Like, you don't have to set up a big, heavy application with a, massive config file and worry about setting up, a bunch of crazy things. You just give a user access to the directories you want them to have access to, and they SSH in. It's that easy. Now, SSHFS is more than just an SSH session on the console. It does actually give you like a fully mounted file system on the other end, but it's all just tunneled over SSH, and it really doesn't work any differently under the hood than just SCPing stuff back and forth.
How is it different permissions-wise than NFS?
Well, the big difference is just that, again, NFS, you can't, without getting into Kerberos, which Corey already said he does not want to do, and I don't blame him, you can't set up password-based authentication for NFS. Without getting into Kerberos, it's just IP-based. So if you want to get it limited to a per-user type of thing, which is usually how I interpret, people saying they want a password restriction. I doubt it's really about the password. SSH keys would probably be fine and even preferable. The whole point is you don't want to just assume, okay, if I'm at this IP address, I have access to whatever the hell I want to on this machine. You want to say, well, Bob has access to this and Alice has access to that, regardless of which machines Bob and Alice are using.
Yeah, I guess it mostly comes down to, do you trust root on the other machines? And for this NFS environment, it sounds like maybe no. But then some of that can be handled with NFS by just doing mapping root to the nobody user, and then only the user Bob on these machines can access any files that Bob would be able to access if they were on the NFS server logged in as Bob, which is similar to what you would get with SSHFS, right? The user you log in as, you have access to whatever they would have if you were on that machine. Anyway. If Corey wants to write in with more detail about exactly what they're trying to do, we might be able to get an even better answer, but I agree that SSHFS is probably the simple solution for now.
Francis writes, I'm currently working on my employer's disaster recovery plan. We use Vault for our secrets management and are considering different options for backups in case we lose access to our Vault cluster. Do you have any recommendations for backing up secrets?
Essentially, I don't have any more specific recommendations for that, because if you're using something like Vault or Bitwarden or what have you, it should be heavily encrypted to begin with. So if you're backing that whole thing up, it's not going to be any good to anybody who doesn't have the credentials to get into it. So ultimately, you back it up like you back up anything else.
I'm not that familiar with Vault. I wonder if the cluster part means that it would be hard to get a cluster up and going to restore stuff. In which case, if it has some option to export the secrets, then you have to do the encryption yourself, and that gets more complicated. The answer there could be something like an encrypted ZFS dataset, or just a file you're encrypting with GPG or something like that, and then backing up. But generally, I expect something like Vault has backup procedures that you'll want to use. And the biggest thing with all of these, as we always say, is practicing the recovery. So stand up some VMs and make sure you can restore all access to all your secrets quickly. And then only then can you be comfortable that your DR plan is actually going to work at 3 a.m. when everything is not ideal conditions.
Absolutely. And as always, the most bulletproof method I know of for backing up anything that you really care about is to make sure you're doing it in a virtual machine, put that virtual machine on a ZFS dataset or ZVol, and back up that dataset or ZVol. At that point, problem solved. You need to restore it? Well, you just spin up the VM based on your backup, and that's it. You're done. You know you don't have any other issues going on.
Yep. It's definitely one of the complexities we've seen with people deploying more and more complicated like Kubernetes and clusters of things is the bootstrapping problem of like, well, if this cluster depends on this other service and that service depends on this third service, how do we get them all running when nothing is up from start? And so as part of your disaster recovery, you kind of want a whole isolated network where you're recovering with There's no other things. You just have the servers you're trying to get up running and make sure that you can bring it up without it depending on a bunch of other things.
There will also be a lot of folks out there who maybe can't afford to have, an entire isolated dev environment for things like this. But usually when you're too small to afford that completely isolated dev network where you can bring up a separate copy of all your things, you can afford a little bit of downtime. So if you're too small for the completely isolated network to do everything, in parallel to what you're doing in production, then you just need to budget some downtime to be able to stop everything and bring it back up again. And you need to start that practice before you're depending on that thing in production. So if you've just implemented this, big, crazy cluster thing that you're super proud of, before you put it in production, the first thing to do is turn it all off and make sure you can turn it on again. Maybe even then, actually, like your full backup and restore process, back the whole thing up and restore it again. Like get all that done, ahead of time as much as you can. And then once it's in production, well, hopefully, how awesome your thing is will help you grow your business to the point that you can afford that isolated dev environment.
Yeah, but at the same time, you can recreate an isolated network environment with a couple of VMs on your laptop. You just configure the networking to not be bridged to the real network, but to exist only between these VMs. So sometimes they'll have to be scaled down a little bit. You're not going to give all the servers the same amount of RAM they have in production, but you can restore your Vault cluster to a couple of small VMs that exist only on your laptop and make sure it works without any access to the rest of the network.
Absolutely.
That was something we would have killed for when I was in college. The ability to run 3 or 4 servers all inside one machine, but we didn't even have hardware virtualization back then.
Right, well, we'd better get out of here then. Remember, show@2.5admins.com if you want to send any questions or your feedback. You can find me at joerest.com/mastodon.
You can find me at mercenariesysadmin.com.
And I'm at Alan Jude.
We'll see you next week.